Vincent Van Gogh is an artist who needs little introduction. Born in 1853, he went on to become, after his untimely death in 1890, one of the most famous of all the post-impressionist painters. After failed attempts as an art dealer in Paris and London, and briefly turning to religion, spending time as a missionary, he eventually took up painting in 1881, and for the next 10 years developed and created an enormous body of work, particularly in the last few years of his life in France. But beyond the starry nights, cafe scenes, and paintings of sunflowers, there are the many works that he did on paper. And it's his drawings that I wanted to draw attention to you in this video. From the very beginning of Van Gogh deciding to become an artist, he became acutely aware of some of the problems that he had, having not been formally trained. One of those principally being the idea of linear perspective. You see here in early examples of his work, although he's displaying elements of linear perspective and grasping elements of them, when it comes to sometimes putting figures in his landscape or the use of scale to create recession, which goes hand in hand with linear perspective, that sometimes he falls short. As seen in the first drawing here, and then in this one here, is that some of the figures don't quite look right in terms of their size to the figures that are meant to be further away. It was not until 1882 and his discovery of the perspective frame did Van Gogh truly come to grips with using linear perspective in his work. He enthusiastically wrote to his brother Theo, "The result is that on the beach or in a meadow or a field, you have a view as if through a window. The perpendicular and horizontal lines of the frame, together with the diagonals and the cross, or otherwise a grid of squares, provides a clear guide to some of the principal features, so that one can make a drawing with a firm hand, setting out the broad outlines and proportions. I expect you can imagine how delightful it is to train this viewfinder on the sea, on the green fields, or in the winter on snow-covered land, or in the autumn on a fantastic network of thin and thick trunks and branches, or on a stormy sky." You see very quickly the change in Van Gogh's work when he starts using the perspective frame, looking through the world, looking for diagonals in which to line up with the strings that he sees in the frame. He would often use the horizon line and place the horizon or the horizontal string along the horizon line, putting the cross sides on a distinctive feature on the horizon line in the distance, and thus being able to keep his eye aligned within the strings of the perspective frame. When you start to, and I would encourage you to do this, is that you can put your perspective frame over Van Gogh drawings and paintings and see how he would compose using these diagonal lines. Not only would he use it in a horizontal landscape format, he would also use that same format in a upright or portrait format. And it's even believed that he may have had more than one of these perspective frames, maybe some that were different sizes and different formats, so that he could use what was appropriate for the scene there in front of him. Here you can see I'm using my perspective frame and taking the photograph through them, lining up that middle string on the horizon and then fixing a point in the crosshairs that I can come back to and keep looking at that fixed point to then judge all the other parts off those lines, dividing the space up and looking for that one-point perspective, a favourite of Van Gogh. For the main part of this exercise, what I want you to do is use the perspective frame like Van Gogh would have used. Find a landscape that has one or displays one-point perspective clearly, like what he would have been attracted to and found, and be looking through that perspective frame as you're drawing. Now, if you're not comfortable with going out far and wide, I'm including here the landscape as being our own landscape that surrounds us here at home. And a good opportunity maybe to get outside and into the garden and be maybe using the frame in a vertical position, like what Van Gogh would have done in that drawing of the cottage garden that we used in the painting exercise last week, and work with it like that. Now just remember, when he's using the perspective frame, he's not always necessarily using the entirety. Sometimes that vanishing point is off to one side, so he's only looking primarily in this part here, and then expands the picture outwards like this, from a point here and expands out this way, or from a point here and expands out this way. So don't just necessarily put it up and just draw what you can see in here. It's not a viewfinder like what we would sometimes use and it looks similar to. It's a perspective frame. It helps put things in their correct size as they disappear into the distance. Once you've found a scene that you're comfortable in, that you want to translate, like the one that you'll be able to see up on the screen now, which is some fields nearby where I live, is you can see there that I have found a subject matter that's a little bit Van Gogh-y, ploughed fields with some trees going down the edge of the field, creating that sense of one-point perspective. And you can see how very quickly I'm able to, with those string lines, see how those trees disappear and start to see some of the other perspective lines that I can be using in the landscape. Those ones along the horizon line or the eye line, and how the trees disappear and the trunks of the trees get closer and closer to that line, and also how some of the furrow lines from the ploughing also start to follow those lines of perspective. There's also some lovely verticals, horizontals in this too, that help and give interest to the picture, as well as some textures that I can follow through with in terms of thinking about my mark making with the pen. So once you've found your scene like that, you're looking through it through your perspective frame, is that you can then start with possibly a little bit of a gesture or a model gesture just very, very lightly, feeling your way around those shapes. Like maybe Van Gogh would have done. And by using the frame to see where certain points intersect with the string lines, basically. Now I'm using a photograph as I'm doing this exercise. I'm not doing it out in the field. You can also start to make some slight changes. So say, for instance, up through here, I'm starting to maybe follow some of those lines of perspective and increasing that feeling up here in these corners, changing the angles that they're starting, or finding diagonals that are pointing towards and creating diagonals pointing towards that vanishing point. Once you have done a bit of a mass drawing like that, is to then start to do some mark making. Now, in terms of this, is not to forget everything else that I've spoken to you about. Still be thinking in terms of masses. So, for instance, like this lovely group of cypresses here in the distance, is that I'm still going to think about those in terms of a mass. So, keeping them together. Thinking about their textural quality in terms of the mark, but also thinking about them in relation that maybe my marks here are small because they're in the distance, and that possibly too is how they're going to interact with the sky and that ground there in front of them. We might just start to sketch in some of those other major elements that we're starting to see. There's those bushes. And there I'm making my marks maybe a little bit further apart and bigger to begin with. And then maybe looking for some of those dark parts where I may put in some extra, and so there's some density then to some parts. So that then there's a feeling of light and dark and form on what we're looking at. thinking about opposing marks as well. So maybe that there's an area there with straight lines. But then maybe those lines become upright. Before going off in another direction. As opposed to maybe those lines there. Here we might do some little curved lines. To start to describe those parts. So just go and take it as far as you want to go. I'm also drawing here on a much bigger scale, simply because it's easier for you guys to see in terms of the filming. You could be doing this on a much smaller scale too, to begin with. As always, good luck with this exercise from this video, and I look forward to seeing what you do. Until then, take care.